My name is Bob Newton. I am the acting director of the Church in the 21st Century Center. A lot of you probably know about the center. Was begun, we're now in our 12th year. It was begun in reaction to the clerical sexual abuse crisis in Boston by Father Leahy, the president of Boston College. And over the years, we've had over 65,000 people come to events like this. We publish a C21 resources, which creates a central theme each semester for not only something that you can read, but also for the programs that we have. And everything that every program we have is videotaped, so that if you have friends who were unable to come, they will be able, within 2 weeks, to go to the C21 website and view the presentation for tonight. My role is very brief. It's to introduce the introducer. So I will stop right now and and I will introduce Connor Kelly, who worked very closely with Father Himes in producing the issue that I hope all of you have received. If you haven't, there are copies on the back staircase. So, Connor.
Well, I'd just like to echo Bob's words of thanks to having all of you join us here this evening for what promises to be an informative and thoughtful discussion of poverty in its ecclesiastical, practical, and theological dimensions. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, friend, and mentor, Father Kenneth Himes, who is indisputably the perfect person to be talking to us this evening about poverty in conjunction with the current issue of C21 Resources, available out back, which he was the guest editor for. Indeed, when the Church in the 21st Century Center decided to respond to Pope Francis's call for a church that is poor and for the poor by dedicating this issue to the question of poverty, there was absolutely no question about who should be the ideal editor. As an associate professor in the theology department and a renowned scholar with wide-ranging expertise in social ethics, Father Himes certainly has the appropriate scholarly credentials to tackle this issue with aplomb, and he did. Among his many publications, he's the author of numerous works touching on the challenge of poverty, including the well-known 101 Questions and Answers on Catholic Social Teaching, and the award-winning Christianity and the Political Order, available in a bookstore near you, shameless plug. Similarly, recent articles in Theological Studies on consumerism and inequality speak to his facility with the issues and questions that surround poverty in today's world. Beyond his academic credentials, which are indeed impressive, Father Himes has exceptional personal qualifications for this particular job. First, he has a clear mode of thinking and conscientious work ethic that can be seen in the comprehension and cohesion of the articles he selected for this issue of C21 Resources. Second, he is a Franciscan, and so has a certain credibility when it comes to issues of poverty. No offense meant to your housemates in the Society of Jesus. And finally, I would say most importantly, Father Himes has a level of generosity that is only possible as a result of a personal commitment to intentional poverty, a fact I know very well, for I was once his teaching assistant. For all these reasons and more then, I ask you to join me in welcoming Father Kenneth Himes to share his wit and wisdom with us in a talk entitled The Poor. What did Jesus preach? What does the church teach? Ken.
Applause is always much more welcome at the end of talks than at the beginning of talks. Listening to Connor's very kind remarks, I sort of remember my mother's advice to my sister when she first started using perfume. She said, sniff a little bit, appreciate it, use it sparingly, but for God's sakes, don't swallow any of it. And so whether I'm the ideal person for this talk, I am not at all convinced, but I'm here and you are, so I'll talk, all right? When I was first asked to do this, and to do this issue of C21 Resources, Bob Newton, Karen Kiefer, Eric Goldschmidt was here then. They talked to me about the topic of poverty and the poor and said, we think you'd be the right person to do this. I wasn't sure of that, but the truth is I knew exactly what I did want to do with the issue if I were to say yes to it. And then they said to me, and you can also have an assistant to work with you on that. And immediately I knew who I wanted to do that with, and that was Connor. And I figured, well, with Connor's hard work and intelligence, and the ideas of Bob and Karen's responsible for the beautiful visuals and the layout of this magazine, I figured, and with my propensity to take credit for everything, this was going to be a great team, and it would work out fine. But what I knew I wanted to do right away was to use C21 Resources to show the depth and the consistency of the Christian tradition's concern for the poor. And so I began to think immediately about putting together something that would sort of back up and demonstrate the consistency and depth of that commitment by doing something in the Old Testament, and then the New Testament, and then the patristic era, and then the late patristic, early medieval era, and then the high medieval era, and then the Reformation era, and the Renaissance. And I realized that I was now up to about 800 pages and hadn't even gotten to the modern era. So I realized I couldn't do things simply chronologically. But I still wanted to do something that reflected the diversity of viewpoints within the Christian tradition, and something that showed the kind of comprehensive breadth that the topic of the poor and poverty calls for within the Christian tradition. And so what I settled on was that we would look at the topic through various forms of poverty. And that's really what I want to talk with you a little bit about tonight, in terms of how the Christian tradition has thought about poverty in terms of its various guises. Because the term poverty evokes different ideas in different thinkers and writers and activists within the Christian tradition. And spend a little time thinking and talking about that with you tonight, or this evening. It might be tonight by the time I'm finished, so that's a warning. In the Old Testament, poverty was more commonly viewed as a social condition than an economic one. That is, it was sometimes it was treated in the context of a lack of goods or of the reality of beggarдom in the ancient world. But of course, for much of the ancient Near East, we are dealing with a subsistence economy. Right? A certain lack of goods was hardly a distinguishing characteristic for most people. Almost everyone lacked material goods. Most people lived on the margins of subsistence. Right? And so in the Old Testament, really what you find is this social idea that poverty is linked to the experience of being weak, being dependent, being inferior, indeed being oppressed. Israel knew this condition. Its slavery in Egypt was paradigmatic for the Israelites. Its struggle with the Philistines and Canaanite tribes as it moved into Palestine. Its experience with the empires of Assyria, Babylon, and Rome. The Jewish people knew firsthand and regularly the experience of being humbled, being weak, being oppressed. And so in the Old Testament, you find three views. One, there is an appreciation of the secular wisdom of the world at the time that saw poverty as a consequence of laziness. Poverty came about because of foolish behavior, because of idleness. And yet, the Israelite people were wise enough to realize that's not quite the whole story. And so there was a second, more theological rendering of poverty. Poverty was seen as divine retribution. It was punishment for Israel's infidelity. Poverty is evil, but it has been sent by God to chastise Israel for its transgressions against the covenant. Now, to the Israelites' lasting credit, they saw the inadequacy of that view as well. They came to realize that many unrighteous and unjust people make out fairly well in this world. And indeed, many poor and neglected people go to their graves suffering with their poverty unrelieved. And so they came to see poverty as a scandal. Poverty was not the condition that ought to be. Poverty ought not be accepted as normal or acceptable. It should be resisted. It ought to be overcome. And in the Old Testament, this is done chiefly in two ways. First, by almsgiving and by concern for that famous biblical trinity, the poor, the widow, the orphan, or I might say instead of the poor, the exile, the widow, and the orphan, the refugee in our midst. And secondly, by prayer and lamentations made to God, imploring God for relief and assistance to the poor. In this view, God had a special attachment to the poor. And indeed, God measured the faith of others by how they treated the poor. And this, you see, is where it's so important to think in terms of that trinity of widow, orphan, exile, or refugee. In a world that was ordered around patriarchy and tribe, to be a widow, a woman, without a male heading her household, to be a child and without a male protector or guardian, to be a refugee and to be outside the normal bounds of the tribe's concern for its own, this is to make one thoroughly isolated and alienated. This is to make one marginalized in the midst of people. To be a widow, an orphan, an alien was simply another way of talking about marginalization and oppression. And the Old Testament comes to see that the treatment of that trio becomes the test for whether or not one is being faithful to Yahweh. All of those viewpoints coexist within the Old Testament. We can find multiple passages in the Old Testament that back up one or the other of those three approaches to poverty. From the outset, when we move to the Christian community, what we find is that community has wrestled with the realities of poverty and the poor right from the get-go. Early disciples of Jesus and members of the early Christian communities were not among the elite of their societies. They were not the top 1%. They weren't even the top 5%. Likely as not, they were largely small farmers, urban tradespeople, who were poor in the sense that they were never far from economic disaster. A drought, an illness, a war, or some other social calamity. They simply lacked the reserves to get them through hard times. The truly destitute, street beggars, widows, and orphans, day laborers. These people were truly at the bottom of the pyramid. And some of these were also Christian. The elites in the New Testament, when one looks at it, are often viewed negatively in the parables. Think of the rich man and Lazarus, or the rich fool who builds bigger barns to store up his wealth. Jesus, as we know, preached in parables that touched upon the reality of poverty in the everyday lives of his listeners. In the Acts of the Apostles, there are scenes of the early church struggling with how to think about possessions. The famous passage where Barnabas is praised for selling a piece of property and bringing the proceeds of that sale and placing it at the feet of Peter to be distributed to the other members of the community as the needs arise. And that was contrasted with the example of Ananias and Sapphira, that first sort of couple who have lived in Trump Tower, who sell their property and, of course, come before Peter and put out part of the proceeds, but keep a little back for themselves. And as God was wont to in those days, he struck them down dead at the moment it happened. We're glad that God has learned patience with us as the years have gone on. In several letters of Paul, right, we find Paul appealing to the Gentile communities to take up collections that he could bring back and help the poorer Jerusalem community in their situation. We also find Paul preaching in Corinth about the scandal of rich and poor celebrating Eucharist apart from one another. What happened, of course, was as the Corinthian church grew in numbers, they couldn't assemble all in one place. So there began to be house churches and house assemblies as the community celebrated in different locales. But in some of those locales, the poor were not welcome to come. In some of those locales, the poor were not invited because the richer members of the community took to the practice of having a festive meal along with their celebration of the Eucharist. And Paul excoriates them for not understanding the meaning of Eucharist if you can divide the community the way that practice does. And James, in his letter, scolds a Jewish Christian community because it overlooks its poorer members while it fawns over a rich man who enters the room. The constant refrain in the New Testament texts is not that of political reform or of new economic structures. These are not realistic options in the Roman Empire for the Christian community. But what must be done and expanded upon is the idea of the works of mercy, extended even beyond the borders of one's ethnic group. Gentile Christians have obligations to Jewish Christians and vice versa. But also, of course, even extended beyond one's religious group, as Christians began to move out into the wider society and cities of the empire and still maintain the practice of charity to the needy. In short, the neighbor becomes anyone in need. Now, later Christians, hermits, theologians, monks, mendicants, mystics, social reformers, spiritual writers, they're all there, right? All of them added their voices to this discussion of poverty within the Christian tradition. At times, it's praised as a virtue. It's blessed as a condition. And that's part of what's new in the New Testament, that poverty is actually seen as a blessing in the New Testament. But at other times, it's opposed as a social evil. It's cursed as a burden. Poverty has elicited many kinds of reactions. Now, part of what accounts for the range of viewpoints is that poverty refers to different realities. So it would be useful to point out the various meanings of poverty. Theologically, I would like to suggest to you the most fundamental reality of poverty is that of creatureliness. In a very real sense, theologically, to be human is to be poor. This is the essential poverty of finitude. Not one of us willed ourselves into existence, and none of us can sustain our existence. In a word, to be a creature is to be contingent. You and I are quite simply unnecessary. Hard as it is for us to swallow, we are simply unnecessary. None of us need be. The simple fact is, you and I are contingent. To be creature is to be contingent. G.K. Chesterton, the famous British writer, wrote a book on the life of Francis of Assisi. And of course, as Kenneth said, being a Franciscan, part of the deal in my contract with BC is I get to quote Franciscan things rather than Ignatian things in my talks. So no talk of discernment tonight, but let me tell you about Francis of Assisi. But in Chesterton's little book on Francis, which really is not so much a biography as a meditation on Francis, Chesterton recounts the story of Francis going up into the hillside around the Umbrian Valley, and he's on this mountain, and he's looking out at the city of Assisi on the other side of the hill. And if you've ever been to Umbria, you know what those hill towns were like. They were built with stone, thick, heavy walls for purposes of defense. Homes are all built with stone, thick and flat. And so what happens is the impression you have of Assisi perched on this hill is of this very solid, weighty mass of a walled medieval fortress city. And Chesterton says, one of the things about Francis's conversion is he begins to view the world in a different way than most people. He sees the same world, but he sees it differently. And the image Chesterton has is Francis being something of the street clown and public theater personality that he was. Francis is doing tumble salts along the hill, and all of a sudden he looks out as he's doing a tumble salt, and he sees Assisi upside down. And now the very things that gave Assisi strength and security, its weight, its solidity, its mass, now turned upside down, it hangs precariously over the abyss. Assisi hangs there ready to fall. And what keeps it going? And what Francis realizes is the only thing that holds this whole city in existence is God. That's the experience of contingency. To paraphrase Thomas Aquinas, if the world were to come to an end, God would not have to do anything. For the world to come to an end, God would have to stop doing something, because God continues to sustain the world in existence. That's what makes us alive and here. We need not be, and yet we are. So if we exist, we have been brought into life by a creator God. And as Christians, we believe that the Creator's will is loving and purposeful. So because of our innate poverty, because of our lack of necessity, because we are thoroughly and utterly contingent, because of our innate poverty, that does not lead us to despair. It leads us to an appreciation that the only reason I exist is because I have been loved into existence by a gracious God. The God who need not have loved me does. The God who need not have created any of us has. That's the realization of the poverty of the human condition. it does not lead to despair. It leads to gratitude. You and I are simply the product of God's love. That's the universal reality of human dependence. And that is the fundamental poverty that makes us aware that everything that exists, including ourselves, including our enemies, is a grace. The essay by Johann Baptist Metz in this issue of the magazine was one of the very first ones I settled on, where he talks about the temptation of Christ in the desert. It's a wonderful meditation on how the incarnation is the event of the God who became poor in the person of Jesus. Very quickly, what Metz says is, when you look at the temptation narrative, what are the temptations? He says, we all talk about 3 temptations. Remember, Jesus is tempted to have the angels come and bring you food and drink. Oh, stand up here at this mountain and look at the kingdoms of the world, and they could all be yours if you would just bow down and worship. Oh, let me take you to the parapet of the temple. Throw yourself off. The angels will catch you. They'll bring you to safety. And Metz says, there's not 3 temptations. There's only one. It's all the same temptation. The temptation is about have all the food and drink you want. Have no material needs. You'll be taken care of. It's about have power. Have more power than the Caesars. Have more power than the pharaohs. Be all powerful. The temptation is be secure. No harm could ever come to you. There is nothing that could happen that can harm you. Be totally secure. In other words, it's the same temptation. Jesus, don't be a human being. Stay God. The temptation for Jesus is turn the incarnation into a little piece of theater. Act like you're human, but don't really become human. Act like you are humble and simple, but stay God. Stay secure. All needs satisfied. All power at your feet. And the drama, of course, is that in Jesus, God becomes something other than God. God becomes like you and me. God enters into the poverty of the human condition. God takes on neediness, insecurity, powerlessness. Christ takes it on and makes it part of his life. That's the temptation. Don't be human. Jesus is the one who confronts the poverty of the human condition most clearly in the temptation narrative. So that's what I mean by fundamental or basic poverty, theologically speaking. But there are other forms of poverty. Of course, in everyday conversation, poverty usually means material poverty, the lack of goods that most of us need to experience a reasonable standard of living. We want security from hunger, from cold, from storms, from illnesses. Countless human beings have not had those things. Right? Millions of people who walked along the face of this planet lacked such basic goods. Deprived of resources for meeting basic bodily needs, way too many people in our world's history have died from hunger, malnutrition, thirst, dehydration, exposure to the elements, treatable diseases. Human beings are physical beings, and we have material needs. The inability to satisfy such needs is a terrible evil inflicted upon those who are materially poor. The Catholic Church's teaching on human rights, since the time at least of John the 23rd, has consistently acknowledged that human beings have rights not only in the realm of civil and political life, a right to peaceful assembly, to due process of law, to free speech, free press, to religious expression, but the Church also asserts, as important as those human rights are, that people also have rights in the area of economic and social life. There is a right to food, to health care, to shelter, to a safe environment, to a basic education. So the lessons of Catholic teaching have long included a special concern for the least well off when assessing a community's commitment to justice. The test of a good community is not how well are those at the top doing. The test is always how well are those at the bottom faring. Can people find work that provides a living wage? Is there an adequate safety net for those who are too old or too young, who are chronically ill or temporarily incapacitated? As St. James indicated in his letter, we are only as good a community, we are only as hospitable, generous, and decent a people as we are hospitable, generous, and decent to the poor among us. That's the standard of measurement if you want to know what a community is. There is also spiritual poverty in our world. One may have adequate material well-being and yet suffer from a profound sense of isolation, cut off from community, from friendship, from intimacy and love. There are those unfortunate people in our midst who are plagued by mental and emotional suffering, for whom the challenge of rising from their bed is a daily struggle with depression, anxiety, grief, despair. In our information-soaked society, there are people whose lack of a basic education keeps them on the margins of society, even if they manage to put food on their tables or find a roof for their heads. There are those with illnesses that prevent them from having the everyday interactions that those of us who are healthy take for granted, that those of us who are unburdened by diseases are able to enjoy in the way we engage one another. And the piece in this new issue that we're dealing with here that I've always found interesting is taken from a sermon of St. John Chrysostom, who reminds us in his reflection on the parable of the rich man and Lazarus that there are the affluent and materially comfortable who are truly poor. There are people abounding in wealth, but starving in virtue. There are those who are propped up with false security, yet their eternal life is at risk. There are people living a life of easy comfort, and yet find no meaning amidst the luxury. To lack the enrichment that comes from personal relationships, of family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, church members, is to live a life that is stunted and impoverished. To be emotionally crippled, spiritually dry, lonely while surrounded by people, is to know the dreadful state of spiritual poverty. While the external face of material deprivation is often the easiest form of poverty to recognize, it is not the only way that a poverty appears in the human situation. We Christians, we must never be indifferent to the material poverty of our brothers and sisters. Yet it is also true that we Christians ought to be among the very first to recognize the signs of spiritual poverty in our own lives as well as in the lives of those we encounter. We must remember the works of mercy are spiritual as well as material. Now, when thinking about spiritual poverty, there is an important distinction to keep in mind, and that is between voluntary and involuntary poverty. From the earliest generations of the Christian community, there were people who voluntarily made themselves poor. People who, for the sake of some spiritual good, whether that good was giving assistance to others by denying themselves, or acquiring some virtue, or engaging in repentance for wrongdoing, or deepening one's prayer life, or imitating Christ, But throughout the history of Christianity, there have been men and women who freely took vows of poverty or simply made decisions to forego material wealth for the sake of their faith. And when that is done in freedom, with a clear understanding of the consequences, and after a period of mature reflection, such a decision has been praised and admired by many as an act of genuine discipleship. But there is also involuntary poverty. The poverty that is not chosen, but imposed. That is not an evangelical ideal, but a countersign to the dignity of the person. Because we are integrated creatures, because we are both body and spirit, it is not possible to divide ourselves neatly. When you and I have a severe toothache, we also become impatient, ill-tempered, self-absorbed, and difficult to live with. When we are in love, the sun seems to shine brighter. The coffee tastes better. Right? The colleague at work is not so annoying. Right? Our inner and outer lives cannot be easily cut off from each other. There is a profound reciprocity between them. Involuntary poverty, physically, can corrupt our inner life, even as it makes our external life difficult. The involuntary poverty of unmet physical needs can crush the spirit of a person. True, voluntary poverty can liberate people to live a life of authentic Christianity. However, involuntary poverty can oppress people so as to prevent a truly human life. Yet another distinction to bear in mind when thinking about forms of poverty is the difference between relative and absolute poverty. The latter, absolute poverty, can be defined in ways that are connected with the experience of deprivation, whether when essential needs are neglected. Absolute poverty can refer to the failure to satisfy minimal needs of caloric intake or the inability to find shelter adequate to prevent frostbite. Absolute poverty means the lack of goods that permit daily subsistence. It entails a state of destitution that deprives a person of essential food, potable water, effective sanitation, shelter, health, and education. It refers not only to income, but to access to goods. Tattered and shrunken as it may be, the safety net in most economically developed countries is meant to raise all people above the level of absolute poverty. The World Bank has put a dollar figure on absolute poverty in the poorest nations of the globe. It sets the standard at $1.25 per person per day. Of course, conditions in richer nations require a different standard. The United States government sets its poverty standard, according to recent figures, at $15.15 per adult per day, which certainly strikes me as inadequate. Relative poverty is more difficult to define. It is determined with reference to social context. It is most commonly explained by economists and others as the percentage of a population that has less than a certain proportion of the society's median income. For example, if you have less than 50% of the median income of your society, you are considered to be relatively deprived. In short, relative poverty, you see, is really a way of talking about inequality. Relative poverty is not about survival, but it's about whether a person is able to effectively participate in the life of their society. This is not a new idea. Our old friend Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, discussed poverty not as the ability to have adequate goods to sustain life, but rather Smith said poverty is the lack of whatever a nation's customs and lifestyle determine to be a decent standard of living. So, having a telephone may not seem to be a harsh reality. Most of the human race have managed to live without telephones. But in our culture, and we won't even talk about the people on this campus who stare at tiny screens for hours at a time, right? But in our culture, try getting a job, or arranging a doctor's appointment, or being contacted by your child's school if you don't have ready access to a phone. A particular culture or society can make what one culture may have thought to be superfluous, can actually make it a necessary good in order to function in the society. This came home to me years ago. I was one of the people who resisted the cell phone business. Even now, I'm a proud owner of a flip phone. How nerdy is that you have a flip phone? But years ago, I was walking to a meeting in Manhattan, and I was walking along 7th Avenue, and I was at 7th and 34th. That's a pretty big intersection in Manhattan, if you're familiar with it. It's right near Madison Square Garden, Macy's, right? Big intersection. And there was, on each of the 4 corners, a bank of public telephones. 3 phones together on each of 4 corners. I was running late for a meeting. This was before the days of my having a cell phone. And I wanted to call ahead and say, look, I'm coming, but I'm running late. I had just come up from Penn Station and gotten off the Amtrak. And I went to the first phone, no receiver. Second phone, whatever was on that machine, I wasn't going to put it next to my ear, right? Over here, no dial tone. Cross the street, check there, nothing working there. The next street, I went through 9 phones. Not one of them worked, not one. And I'm standing there ready to cross to the final bank of phones, and I'm at the red light, and I look at the cars in front of me, and there they are, 5 across. Everybody was talking on the phone in their car. That's when I realized, Himes, you better get a cell phone, right? But the point is, when your employer, right? When your doctor, when people you have to deal with and relate with, your landlord, when people presume they should be able to get you and they can't, right? You become marginalized. You become ineffective. You become non-productive in this society. The words you've been waiting for. Finally, all right? There is the issue of another distinction, and that is, how should Christians respond to the fact of the poor in our midst? How respond both to those close at hand and those halfway around the world? As many of the voices, like those of Dorothy Day or Peter Morin, both of whom are in this issue of the magazine, as their voices can be heard, make clear, there's always a profound obligation among Christians to provide for the poor through charity. Almsgiving has always consistently been counted as being at the heart of the Christian life. Indeed, one of the most vivid of all portrayals of divine judgment, of course, is the parable of Matthew 25, where the sheep and the goats are separated on the basis of whether or not you recognized Christ in the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, the imprisoned brother or sister. Charity is at the heart of Christian discipleship. However, the argument has been made that charity can sometimes just be a Band-Aid, put on a problem that must be addressed at a much deeper level. One description is that charity is equivalent to pulling drowning people out of a river. That's a necessary and life-giving service, to be sure, But justice goes upstream to find out why people are falling in the river in the first place and builds a safe bridge that people can walk across the river. Therefore, charity becomes less necessary, less urgent. If you see things that way, the advocates of justice can begin to demean the works of charity. That's just simply saving victims. The work of justice is understood as keeping people from being victimized. Meanwhile, the agents of charity can dismiss the advocates of justice as, you people don't want to get your hands dirty by getting down and close to the poor in your midst, by working in direct service to the needy. Drawing the relationship of charity and justice that way, it seems to me, is a terrible disservice to the Christian tradition. Another way to think about this is to see these two virtues, and they are both virtues, charity and justice, in the way that I like to suggest Benedict XVI did in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate. He describes the work of justice, and I quote here, as the institutional path. We might also call it the political path of charity. No less excellent and effective than the kind of charity which encounters the neighbor directly. In other words, justice can be understood as the political expression of charity, or it's the application of charity to the institutional and structural aspects of our life as a society. These are two complementary and necessary moments in the response of Christians to the evil of poverty. Philanthropy and personal involvement are vitally important as disciples follow in the way of the Lord Jesus. But preventing future and further poverty through necessary social reform is also a work of neighbor love. Indeed, it may be the best way that we can assist the distant neighbor whom we will never meet face to face. The documents of Catholic social teaching make clear that the Christian tradition sets charity and justice not in tension, certainly not in opposition, but rather holds them up as dual obligations for those of us who hope one day to hear the words of Matthew 25. Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. May we all as Christians be companions to and advocates for the poor in our midst. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. There are two Beatitudes now on poverty. Blessed are the poor and blessed are the poor in spirit. I've heard so many comments on contrasting or comparing these two. I'd be interested in your take on these.
Yeah, I think that sometimes more has been made of that than ought to have been made. It's clear that Luke, and Luke says, blessed are the poor, right? It's clear that in Luke's gospel, Luke does have a very fundamental concern for material well-being in the poor. I mean, that's clear. It starts with the infancy narratives, right? In terms of how, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus are portrayed, right? Aliens in the land, right? People without a home, all right? Laid in the manger, these sorts of images. There is this concern in Luke to identify Jesus with the poor, and I think that's there. But it's not as if Matthew is indifferent to that by saying poor in spirit, right? I think what Matthew is getting at is it's not contrasting spiritual poverty with material poverty. I think it's Matthew simply talking to his community, all right? Probably more of a Jewish Christian community, right? These are people, they know material poverty. I mean, this is not like they have to be acquainted with it. These people are people who themselves are faced with poverty in their midst. It's that I think Matthew is concerned with dealing with the dynamics of inward conversion in Matthew's gospel. That an important part of conversion and discipleship for Matthew is it's not just the external works of righteousness. They're not to be dismissed. But what Matthew wants to highlight always is there is an internal conversion, an inner life that has to be nurtured in the life of the disciple. And so what we don't want is someone who, engages in a kind of, limousine liberalism. They write a check in Christmas and it gets blown up in a big picture and they stand there giving it to some poor enfeebled orphan, and then you go off and you live your life in trouble. Matthew, I think, speaks to that part of the community that says, no, it's not just simply, the casual offhand act of physical or material generosity. It's also about taking on an inner life and an inner spirit, becoming a disciple inwardly as well as in terms of external action. That's how I read it. I don't read it as Matthew and Luke are widely divergent on this. It has to do, it seems to me, with the particular communities they're talking to and their theological interest in terms of where their emphases lay.
Thank you very much, Ken. I've really appreciated. My question has to do with mental poverty or intellectual poverty, which doesn't seem to come in your presentation. Drawing from the resources of Christian tradition, is there something we can say about intellectual poverty?
About?
Intellectual poverty.
Oh, intellectual poverty. Ah, yeah. Well, I guess the way I would use it, we can, you can further refine these things, but I guess I would put intellectual poverty in some ways into the, I guess I would incline to be putting it into, intellectual poverty for me is the inability, right? The inability to imagine an alternative world to the one you have, right? Too often, I think, when we hear the word imagination, we think, make-believe. Imagination is fairy tales. Imagination is Sleeping Beauty or, whatever it may be. But properly understood, imagination is a very powerful aspect of human intellect. Imagination is that aspect of our intellect that allows us to construe a world that has meaning for us, right? It's our ability to look at a world and say, this is the way the world ought to be, right? These are the ways in which people ought to live with one another, or how they ought to live with one another. Imagination becomes that ability that allows us to say, the present situation needs transformation, and the transformation must move in this direction rather than that direction. So for me, intellectual poverty really has to do with, for me, it means less to do with, how many years of schooling have you had, or, is your intellectual property rights being transgressed? Rather, it has to do with the idea of, are some people so deprived, so violated, so oppressed, that they basically have been robbed of hope. They cannot imagine something beyond their present situation of misery. And to me, the real task really then is, I think it was that wonderful book years ago, maybe familiar to many of you, Walter Brueggemann's lovely book, The Prophetic Imagination, right? And Brueggemann makes the point that, if you want to really take the humanity out of a person, take away their hope. Tell them that nothing is going to change. Nothing will get better. Who you are is who you are forever, right? You can't change. Others can't change. Society can't be renewed, right? We do that, right? You put prophets out of work, right? prophets are about spreading hope, right? Giving people a vision of where we're going, right? Of what we're called to be. And for me, intellectual poverty is the inability to even sort of construe that sort of world that allows us to aspire to something.
There are political movements afoot, the living wage ordinance around income inequality, and the ballot question that's coming up in November regarding wage and time off and so on. Do you see a moral dimension for Christians when it comes to voting in that regard?
I certainly see a moral dimension in regard for Christians being serious citizens and taking their vote seriously. Is it possible that when you come down to the details of a given piece of legislation or the details of a given politician's political platform, whatever, that good-hearted, good-willed people are going to see some differences, or think that, gee, that's not the best strategy to get us to where we're going. I think those things are possible, but do we have a moral obligation to inform ourselves of what the issues are? Do we have a moral obligation to take seriously our responsibility as voters in a democracy? Do we have an obligation to be informed voters? I think all those things clearly have an imperative. To me, the sign of these sorts of things is, I do think if, I'm a tenured professor at Boston College. Believe me, I'm on easy street, I don't worry if I'm gonna have a job, next week or next month or next year, I'm among the privileged, there's no doubt about that, and you gotta be aware of that if you're here at BC, right? We're the lucky ones, But when you see things like this, when you see movements for a living wage, when you see efforts at unionization of, hospital employees or hotel employees, when you see these kinds of things, I take that as, those are kind of like, the first shoots of green grass after, the wintertime. There's something arising here. There's something happening here. And whether or not you agree with all the details or this or that movement, it's saying something about so many people in our society are struggling and see some need for some profound change in the way we're caring for the weakest among us and the most marginal, and that there are all these different movements trying to do something. Some better than others, some perhaps more politically savvy than others or better thought through, but all these things to me, right, are signs to you in your privileged life in Chestnut Hill. You better recognize that the pain out there is starting to take visible form. It's starting to find a political voice. And for me, that's why you can't be indifferent to that. You cannot not be concerned enough to try and learn about it and what's going on here. Because for me, that's really sort of a way of looking at, this is the grassroots, This is those early shoots of grass coming up that are telling me the Spirit's moving me, right? The Spirit is challenging me to ask, your life of comfort is not the life that most people are living in this society right now. And these actions are simply political expressions, it seems to me, of people's pain.
Hi, Ken. Somewhat somewhat related to the previous question, absent personal conversion and in a multi-faith context, how would you argue for building bridges and pulling babies or human beings out of the river?
Yeah, well, that's a good one, Megan. By the way, for those who don't know, that's Megan Sweeney, who is the director of the Pulse program here at BC, which is our service learning program. It does great work with our undergrads in terms of they're involved in studying theology and philosophy while they're also doing 12 hours of volunteer service per week off campus in the greater Boston area. So Megan knows whereof she speaks. I think, Megan, here is where I think you gotta have two things. One, the response can't be apathetic. It can't be indifferent, right? You can't let people off the hook to not respond. But I do think we have to be individual in the way we carve out those responses. Somebody who's, 70 in good health and retired can respond in a different way to direct service than a mother who's got 2 or 3 young children preschool age, you know? Different people can do different things given their talents, their times, the stages of their life. What you might be able to do at one point in your life is different than what you'll do at another point in your life, you know? People's incomes, work habits, you know, lifestyles, all these things can change, right? And that affects the individual response. It may well be that some people have a particular gift for doing more of the direct service. You know, they're really good at it. You know, this is what feeds their soul in an important way. And there are others who are really good at political organization or running meetings and, you know, putting organizations and groups together, convening folks, doing community organizing. My concern is that the church, qua church, needs to do all of that. Does every individual need to do all of that? I don't think so. You know, I don't think we can ask it of every individual. But I think what we can ask of every individual needs to respond to the reality of the poor in our midst. But what that response looks like, I think, will vary and should vary from individual to individual. But if it ever comes to the point where the Christian community completely ignores structural reform, or completely ignores direct service, you know, or pays no attention to campaigns for human rights, or isn't working with, you know, refugees and migrants, or isn't helping young children get decent educational opportunities. If, as a church, we can't say we're covering those bases, then it seems to me the response it lacks the comprehensiveness and depth that we ought to have. But what the individual can do, I think what we have to do is encourage people, really push people to maybe get out in water a little deeper than they'd like to be in, you know. Most of us like to stay pretty close to the shore. Sometimes you got to get out in the deeper water, you know. But at the same time, what we should be doing is making sure if we're asking people to go out in the deeper water, we give them the tools that they need to be successful in whatever it is we're asking them to take on. So I think we should be about convening people, promoting people, educating people with the skills they need to do various ministries. But if those ministries are ministries of social justice or the ministries of direct service, I think you have to allow for the multiplicity of ministries and the diversity of gifts.
How do you reconcile the church's social teaching surrounding poverty with its institutional wealth?
Good question. One of the things they say about the Franciscans is it's one of the things that God does not know is just how much money the Franciscans have, right? It goes along with the other thing God does not know is what is a Jesuit really thinking, right? So those are the two great mysteries there. But I would say two things. One is institutional wealth put at the service, all right, of serving others is not a bad thing, Also, I think we have to recognize there's different kinds of wealth, quite frankly, I haven't been in the Vatican Museum in a long time, but I've been there, and it's beautiful, and it's overwhelming, and we could sell it all, a one-shot fire sale and get rid of it all, and half of it winds up in the private homes of the 1%, and no one ever sees the art again, and we got a pile of money for a while, but then what, I think we need to recognize there's wealth in terms of land, which in some cases is important, in some other economies, less important, liquidity, capital. From what I can tell, the church hasn't managed its money very well, The fact of the matter is we probably should be wealthier than we are if in fact we had capable oversight and guidance from people who actually were trained in the use of wealth and oversight, But it's the Vatican and most dioceses are pretty secretive about what they do with money, and it's pretty clerical up until fairly recently. So some of this has to do with responsible use of what we have, rather than that we should have anything, It's if we use our resources for the well-being of others, I don't think it's a bad thing to have resources, right? I think it's better than not having resources and just having good intentions, Part of what we need is to use the resources, bring them together, then in fact we direct them to the benefit of all. I'll tell you this doesn't fully answer your question, but it's just a great story that I'll share with you, right? Not really a true answer to your question, but it does shed a little light on something. A number of years ago, I was teaching down in Washington at the time, and I had a Episcopal priest come to see me. She was from San Francisco. And because she was a woman in the Episcopal Church, she couldn't get a parish. She was ordained, but no parish hired her. But she worked in a day shelter for the homeless in San Francisco, which is a huge problem, of course, as you may know, in San Francisco, a lot of homelessness. One day, come around Christmas time, a truck pulls up, and this rather well-dressed woman comes out with 2 or 3 people carrying cartons on a dolly, and she brings them in, they put them there, and she goes over to this Episcopal priest and says, this is for the poor here, a donation for them. I'd like to give these to the poor. Oh, thank you very much, and the woman leaves. They open up the boxes, and they are big, like coffee table size art books, right? And she says her first reaction is, this SOB just dumped, stuff she didn't want on us, right? But they take them out of the boxes and they put them around the day shelter. And within 8, 9 hours, they were almost all gone, right? And she said, leaving that evening, yeah, she found a couple of the books in the gutter, She found a couple of the books in the trash can. She saw 1 or 2 people lying under some books on a bench in a park, using them as a blanket. But they weren't all there. And the next day or two, she goes into the shelter, and there were some of these homeless people sitting there in the shelter, and they're looking through the art books. And she went up to one of the women and said, gee, do you like that? I mean, is that really what you want, as a Christmas gift and this sort of stuff? And the woman said to her, just because I'm poor doesn't mean I don't like beauty. I think we need to recognize there's various ways in which you can feed the poor, And sometimes it's their spirit. Sometimes it's respecting them that, yeah, they can appreciate beauty, You don't have to own a home to like Monet, You don't have to be, middle class and college educated to enjoy, Rodin, So I do think we need to think creatively about the use of these resources. Some of it may be to translate it into fungible capital, but I wouldn't rule out the usefulness of using what we have in other ways that nurture the spirits and the lives of poor people.
We're going to just take one more question. Steve, we'll close with you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ken. That was a great talk.
Thanks,
and
Steve.
I really think you're one of the stars of the faculty here at BC. You're supposed to all clap when I say that, too.
That's one of the gurus of this undergrads on this campus, Steve Pope.
So I want to underscore something you said. I think there's an invisible kind of poverty in our society, and it's the poverty of mental illness. And it's something we don't see, we don't recognize. You can see it with homeless, mentally ill people, but people avoid them like the plague, literally. And I think it's one of the great tragedies of our society. We put them in prisons, so we don't have to see. And maybe a third of our prisons have people with serious mental illness. So thank you for bringing up despair. That's a form of deep despair and hopelessness and isolation. But the question is, you didn't really talk much about solidarity. And charity is a virtue, justice is a virtue. Solidarity is kind of the last 50 years we've been talking about solidarity with the poor. A lot of people think of solidarity as a special virtue for a few people with a special calling, Franciscans, or Jesuits who are, in El Salvador. But we keep hearing also from the church that solidarity with the poor is a requirement of Christian life. So I have two parts of my question. One is, do you think it is part of every Christian life, that is solidarity with the poor is part of Christian life? And what does that mean? Number 2, at BC, we're a very wealthy school. Not everybody here is wealthy. But what can we do that we're not doing already to increase our students' access and interest in and commitment to solidarity with the poor?
Yeah, I mean, really good question, Steve. I don't know I have answers that can satisfy you, but a quick swing at it, all right, is I think, is it essential to the Christian life, not just an option for some? I think it's essential, right, to the Christian life. And the reason being is, it seems to me that part of this tradition is, and so much it seems to me, of life comes down to, it's about optics, you know? And as you were saying with the mentally ill, if you don't see it, you don't respond to it, right? We've all been in a room, right, where maybe there's a very intimate conversation going on, or maybe there's been angry words said, or there's some tension in a room, and somebody walks into the room, you know, singing tra-la-la, and, you know, starts cracking jokes, and you just say, this person isn't reading the moment, you know? They don't see what's going on here, yeah? They just aren't picking up on what's happening. And I think that's true of an awful lot of us, right? You only respond to what's real to you, right? Unless the poor are real, we're not going to respond to them. And we live in a world where, as privileged people, it's pretty easy to live without a whole lot of direct contact with the poor, you know? I mean, you know, we pick on, you know, gated communities and, you know, suburbs and all this stuff. But there's something to that critique, but it's not just there, you know? It's the high rises, you know, with the doormen, and, you know, you don't see the poor there, you know? It's, you know, we don't go to public parks, we go to country clubs, you don't see the poor there. You don't go to public beaches, you go off to private beaches at the Cape or something, you don't see the poor there. We have managed to create a society where if you want to, you can pretty much avoid the poor full time, you know? And so part of what solidarity, it seems to me, is about is you begin to see the world the way the poor see it, you know? You enter into a world and you face the world as it really is, not this safe haven that you construct for yourselves, you know? The example for me that brought it home to me was when my sister, we were all much younger, and my younger sister had her first child. My younger sister was a slob, all right? She was a slob, all right? And then she gets married and has a baby, and she comes back to my mother's apartment, and she walks into the apartment with the baby who's now like, I don't know, 1.5, 2, starting to move around, you know, crawl a little bit. Well, my sister walks in, and she is like, you know, lifting up, you know, every ashtray, every breakable thing on the coffee table. You know, she's putting a hand, you know, right here at the chair because it has a sharp edge. You know, all of a sudden I realized my sister, who paid no attention to the house in terms of furniture, cleanliness, none of it. Now she walks to my mother's apartment. As far as my sister's concerned, my mother's apartment is a death trap for my niece, you know? It's like all these things are going to hurt my niece, and she's seeing every one of them. What changed was, you know, my sister Eileen is now a mother, and she sees the world through her kid's eyes, right? Now she sees all the things that could happen to a kid, right? Her optics changed. I think what solidarity is about at heart is coming to see things differently. You come to see things through the eyes of people you don't normally see them through. And I think it's essential to have solidarity with the poor, that we begin to see the world they see, right? Because most of us, we move through it, we can sleepwalk through the world we live in, you know? I can live my life, quite frankly, I probably could put 75% of it on automatic pilot and get through the day, you know? The poor can't do that. It's an hourly struggle, you know? So solidarity, essential, because you have to see reality. If you don't see reality, you won't respond to reality, right? And we need to sharpen our vision and get it in focus. As for what BC can do, well, you know, in some ways, it goes back to the question that was asked earlier about intellectual poverty. We can train fantastic, you know, pre-med people here and pre-law and, you know, engineers and biologists and theologians and philosophers. We can train people with all these intellectual skills, but unless we make that knowledge real, right, it's a head trip, you know? And education shouldn't just be getting facts. If you want that, we just upload everybody's computer, You know, give them all the facts in the computer, and they can walk around with that for the rest of their life. They got the facts at hand, you know. Education's also about formation, right? It's about helping people learn what to do with the facts, right? How to become wise and compassionate in the way we utilize the facts to be of assistance to people, right? So I think part of what we need to do is always help people see that it's not just about knowledge as a head trip, it's about knowledge that transforms your life. It's about learning stuff that I all of a sudden realize, oh, that's another way to live, you know? Oh, that's another set of priorities than the ones I have. Why? You know? Gee, that's a set of values that matter to you. I wouldn't have thought that about myself. Why not? I mean, you get people thinking those ways, that's how education begins to be transformative, you know? And I think that, in the end, is is what solidarity is about. It's entering into the pain of other people, you know? And for many of us, we shield ourselves from the pain rather than enter into it.